everything comes to the floor in such a hyper-partisan manner.
I would argue that it's already in the Constitution.
We've overtaxed people.
People like to legislate by emotion.
It's important to address when the governor oversteps his boundaries.
I'll pull up my pocket version here.
1,000-page omnibus bills that nobody knows what's in it. And welcome to another episode of the Omnibus Podcast. I'm Jeremy Munson, and I'm joined with Walter Hudson. On this week's episode, we're going to be talking about a potential new Senate Majority Leader in the Minnesota Senate as the current Majority Leader kicks off a potential gubernatorial campaign. Who's going to be the new Majority Leader, and will they actually be a Republican? We'll get to that question later. Then we'll dive into talking about Representative John Thompson. Will he resign? Will he resign as of the time I finally get around to editing this podcast and getting it out there? Things are changing quickly in that. We'll talk about the latest details we've heard of. And then we'll talk about whether or not Democrats will actually be asking Keith Ellison to resign. We'll talk about COVID and coming around the world, these new variants, Australia being locked down, and then we get into critical race theory passing in the Mankato School District and coming to a town near you. Walter, thank you for joining me on another episode. For the listeners who don't know who Walter Hudson is, Walter, go ahead and introduce yourself.
I started out as an activist, a Tea Party activist, and became a professional commentator through sheer force of will. I was an associate editor for Newsreel blog, which was a David Horowitz publication, and was a contributor to PJ Media for some time before earning a nighttime show at Twin Cities News Talk, which I ran for 3 years. And somewhere in the midst of all of that, I got elected to the Albertville City Council, and I've served for a number of years there.
All right. And I'm Jeremy Munson. I was an upset voter, upset about Obamacare, and ran for office. And now I am armed with an election certificate and I can write laws. So I try to bring you some more detail on legislation and insight into what's going on in the Capitol each week on the Omnibus Podcast, where all subjects are germane, just like piling all this garbage into omnibus bills that happens in the legislature. So first off, I wanted to give people a little insight on some goings-ons. Of course, we're not in session. We're in what's called the interim, in between sessions, although we will be coming back for a special session, which we talked about in last week's episode in September, likely to just dole out money. There will be some changes as Senator Paul Gazelka, who's the Senate Majority Leader, is likely going to be kicking off a campaign to run for governor against Tim Walz. When he does this, the Senate will likely vote for a new Senate Majority Leader, as after all, Senate Majority Leader's job is to raise money for the Senate Victory Fund, which is the political arm that funds the campaign to really take the majority in the Senate. And there's a major conflict of interest when the Senate Majority Leader is also out trying to raise millions of dollars for his own gubernatorial election. So they're going to just elect a new Majority Leader. Now, who is it going to be? That's the big question, because are we going to get a strong conservative who's going to be fighting in this next legislative session, which is primarily about policy, along with potentially an ugly bonding bill? Are we going to get a conservative who will say, you know what, we just dumped billions of dollars across the state. We don't need another bonding bill. We're going to push back on the gas tax and push back on some other junk? Or are we going to get a squishy liberal senator or somebody from a swing district who's going to cave on green energy and stuff like that? That's going to be a really big decider. And I've heard some names floated. I've heard people from Jeremy Miller, who's the Senate president, who's really just kind of runs the floor show, but he's from Winona, which is a very blue district. The guy started the Purple Caucus, kind of the moderate Republican caucus in the Senate. And it probably a concern for most conservatives if he were to be the Majority Leader. I've also heard that Tom Bach is being considered as the Majority Leader in the Senate.
So you weren't kidding when you said, is it actually going to be a Republican? I thought that was a rhino reference, but no, you mean literally it might not be a Republican.
I'm saying literally the name at the top of the list that I repeatedly hear is Tom Bach. Now, Tom Bach used to be the Majority Leader of the Senate. He was a Democrat, and he's from the range, and legitimately he is pro-gun. He's fairly pro-life, or as pro-life as many of the Republicans. He's very pro-gun, and he's pro-mining, right? So he's arguably more conservative than some Republicans. He left the Democrat Party. I don't know if it's official or not. He calls himself an independent, and he caucuses with the Republicans. This is a change that happened after the last election, and he was in the minority. And in order to come over to the majority to give Gazelka an extra couple seats, he and Tomassoni left the Democrat Party, caucused with Republicans, and got themselves gavels, right? So they chair committees. Tom Bach chairs. He took the gavel from the gavel to chair the bonding committee from Dave Senjum. So he's got himself some power, but he was the former majority leader. So as far as strategy, he has the skills necessary to lead a caucus. As far as his relationship with Democrats, I mean, he's got to be tight with everybody. He led the caucus. He led half the Democrat senators, and he's got a relationship with Walz. I'm told that he's on the outs with Walz, so he doesn't like him, but I don't know if I trust that, right? Certainly, if you're a conservative, you should be upset that the only, leg of the three-legged stool that we have, why would you give those keys over to a Democrat, right?
Well, and I guess that's my question for you. And I know you're not the right person to ask because this wasn't your idea, but you're closer to the internal caucus politics and thought process than any of us are. What is the reason? Like, has any argument been offered as to why this would be a good idea?
He's a good strategy. I mean, there's a huge difference between the House and Senate. We've talked about this 24-hour rule when you have to post stuff 24 hours ahead of time to post amendments, and it's all scripted, and you can control your caucus in the House. In the Senate, it's like prison rules. You can offer amendments on the fly. It takes a little bit more knowledge to manage the strategy and as amendments pop up and stuff, and how to run things on the Senate. But as far as the handling the media and stuff like that, he has a history of doing that. But I don't like the idea of not having a Republican in charge, and I'd like a conservative.
Well, and when you say it's a strategy, I guess my follow-up question would be, to what end? Like, because that to me seems to be the dissonance here between activists, rank and file Republicans, conservatives, people who have certain ideological and legislative goals versus the people who are going to be making this decision, which is elected Republican senators. What is their goal for which Tom Bach is the strategy?
I don't know. He's got relationships with a lot of the commissioners, which isn't a great thing. It's an advantage at the same time. It's also a disadvantage. Tom Bach and Kurt Dowd are really close. They're hunting buddies. In fact, when we passed that amendment at the last day of session to ban legislators from working for lobbying firms, which is what Representative Dowd is one of the people that does that. He called up Tom Bach to see if he could kill the tax bill, kill $1 billion in tax relief. So they have a history, as opposed to Gazelka and Dowd are known to not be close friends, and they don't get along at all. So. I don't know. I've been making phone calls to try to figure out who should be running. Like who is there a campaign going? And I'm told that a lot of them just don't want it. They don't want to deal with it. They have day jobs, and it's one thing to be a part-time legislator, but when you're the majority leader, it's really a full-time job. It's a year-round, full-time, tons of events. You're going to fundraisers all over the state. You should be in a very safe seat. Right? You shouldn't spend your time during the campaign season in your district. You should be out working the whole state. And so you can't pick somebody like Rich Draheim, who's a good conservative, but in a swing district and, has to vote his district. You don't want to target people like that. So I don't know who the right person is. I've also heard Mark Johnson up in the first district, which is like East Grand Forks, way up there, is being considered. But I've also heard Weber is a name dropped that might be. Jasinski, I hear, really wants it. But, there's a lot of different choices. But whoever it is going to decide the strategy for how we're going to stop bad policy next year and how we can try to negotiate to advance conservative policy in the next session.
Well, see, that to me sounds like a very different goal than how you described it earlier. Because at the outset of this discussion, you said that the job of the majority leader is to fundraise and to kind of act as a lead campaigner on behalf of Republican candidates for Senate, chiefly, presumably, incumbents. And that goal is very much potentially at odds with the one you just articulated, which is to pursue legislation and policy which actually conforms with the ideological purpose for which the Republican Party exists. And so to me, that's the heart of this question is what is it that our elected Republicans are trying to achieve? Are they trying to achieve their own political security in terms of being able to ensure that they get to be reelected or that they get to expand their majority or whatever the case may be? Or are they willing to throw everything they've got at whatever it takes to achieve legislative victories that actually put points on the board for conservatives in the state of Minnesota? Because to my mind, and I know it runs counter to conventional wisdom, and there are people who get paid a lot of money to preach the opposite of what I'm about to say. But to my mind, achieving that goal, the activist goal, the legislative goal, the ideological goal, is how you get to the electoral success. And given the piss poor results that we've seen statewide, and the tentative hold we've had on whatever majorities we've managed to maintain over the course of the past few decades, it has the virtue of having not been tried, right? Like maybe we should try a strategy that actually moves the ball downfield on legislation and ideological priorities and what conservative activists want to see happen in this state. Win, lose, or draw on whether or not we actually achieve those goals, because I know that's what the counter is going to be. They're going to say, well, the governor won't sign it. It's not about the governor signing it. It's about you putting the flag in the ground that says, this is where we stand. This is what we're about. This is what you get if you give us more power, because then you can go out and campaign on what you tried to do, on what you left on the field, which is nothing, in pursuit of what people actually want.
Well, it's also important to know that this next legislative session, which is where because we've set the budget now, we have enormous budget for the state. The Republicans, I didn't vote for them, so I'm going to say they voted to increase the size and spending scope of government significantly for this next 2 years. That's done. This next session is all about policy. It's about how we're going to be spending the money, or what things are going to be used for. So not the cost of programs, but laws and judiciary, police reform, all this stuff is going to come up. And this is where we need to start really pushing for conservative policy. And there is an appetite from the Democrats to accept it, because you have Democrats that are in tough districts, and you have a governor who wants to go out to rural Minnesota and win. And he needs to be able to say, well, yeah, we lowered the age for carry permits to 18, which, by the way, I'm writing the legislation, so that'll be out there. But he can, knowing that the Supreme Court is going to likely force his hand anyways, why doesn't he just sign this into law saying that he allowed it, so that he can actually pretend like he's pro-gun? So there's a way for us to advance policy. This is a good opportunity for us, but we need somebody in the Senate that's going to lead on this. And I that's why I think this is a big decision. But when I talk to senators, they're not seeing this as a real big decision. They're just trying to figure out, maybe it's going to be somebody like a Weber from now until January, the start of session, where he hands the reins over to Bach for the session. I don't know, but I think it'll be a disappointment to Republicans if that happens, if they hand it over to Bach, because and also Bach is majorly pro-union, which is, concern I have.
You have to look at this as a campaign decision, right? Because we're in the campaign season, whether you believe that or not. We got people who are home in their districts. We've got parades. We got county fairs going on. And it's not going to be too long before we're looking at caucuses. So the decision that you make here is a decision that is going to one extent or another, define all of your campaigns. Are you willing to aggressively pursue the priorities of the people who almost won this state for Trump? Are you willing to do that? Or are you trying to backtrack to, and I've met Norm Coleman. He's a nice guy. I don't think he's a terrible person. But are you trying to backtrack to Norm Coleman's Republican Party? The nice guy, go along to get along, right? Mm-hmm. That's the choice. And I think we know what they're going to do because it's the same thing they've done for decades, which is why we keep losing. But again, that's my point, is that be bold, like try something different. Why not? What do you have to lose? Your seat? Who cares? What are we achieving with your seat right now? What's that doing for us? Not a whole heck of a lot. So you might as well go for it. You might as well try something bold and different and aggressive that has the audacity of projecting a vision for what life in this state ought to look like. And you can start down that road by electing somebody to leadership who is a bold visionary, who's going to fight the good fight.
Well, I certainly hope they elect a bold conservative and that is focused on this policy. I know that they're really wrapped up into we win the state by winning the range, and Tom Bach and Thomas Soni are key to that, but they're going to be, I think we already have the range. I think that they're convinced, especially with the Line 3 stuff going on and Polymet, that we're going to get the Iron Range voting with us next time. There's no problem with that. Let's move on. Let's talk about John Thompson here. We covered him a little bit last episode. The guy's got himself, it's just everywhere you look, more stuff pops up. There was a Facebook post of his wife's that he was responding to and just berating her on this thing. And then, you just don't
viciously with the kind of language that you would expect from like a gangster rap song, or a domestic abuser, ironically. The idea that a sitting state legislator took the time to write those comments, deliberate over whether or not they were just right, exactly what he wanted to say and put out there for all the public to read, and then hit send. That tells you who we're dealing with. Yeah,
and I'm hoping that we can show the graphic here of maybe like his wife's post, calling him out, like, hey, you asked me to delete your stuff, you know how to do it, and then trashing him, and then he goes out there and just berates her. And then this last word that took me a while. It takes me a while to read this kind of lingo, but he ends in this long word, which I saw as a hashtag on Twitter. And I was like, what is this? People were responding to my post with it. And then I saw this and figured out where it came from. Pretty offensive. And then if you read the police reports about him exposing himself to young children and, talking about oral sex, it's just a little, it's out there, all allegations. He's not been convicted of anything. I think in previous court stuff, it's been pled down to a pretty petty misdemeanor or something. And so he hasn't been convicted of domestic abuse. And but certainly there's allegations that are credible.
Right. So we have to put this in context, though, right? We have to put this in the context of his most recent behavior, including the social media comments that we just cited. And we also have to put this in the context of how his party, the Democrats, both in this state and nationally, have treated so-called credible accusations of domestic violence. We were told for a good long time over the course of the past 4 years that we need to believe women just at face value. Just believe whatever comes out of their mouth uncritically, without questioning. All right, that's not my standard, but that's their standard. That's the standard that they've set. All right, well, you got to believe her then. This is coming in a context where if we know, and I hate to play this card because ineffective rhetorically in dealing with Democrats, but it's nonetheless factually correct. If the roles were reversed, the evidence that has been presented is all it would take for the entire institutional media and the Democrats and all of their allies throughout the culture to condemn whatever hypothetical Republican representative was accused under these circumstances with this testimony. It is a credible accusation because it is not coming out of the blue. It comports with behavior that we have seen in real time. And it's also, it matches a pattern that we've seen in the kind of martyrs and heroes that have emerged from the Black Lives Matter movement. There has been this pattern of men who have become symbols of BLM, either because they were victims of police-involved shootings or they had some encounter with police, where when you look into their history, lo and behold, they're abusers of women. In some cases, convicted. George Floyd pointed a gun at the pregnant belly of a woman whose house he invaded criminally. Okay? That fits a pattern of behavior for BLM martyrs and BLM activists, as it turns out. Violence, disregard for the weak, a kind of Nietzschean will to power that is vile and inexcusable. So all of that has to be taken into consideration when we evaluate these accusations. It's not proof, but then again, this isn't a court of law. We don't need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that John Thompson has done any of these things. He is unfit to be a state representative by virtue of the fact that we even have to ask the question. His character should be beyond dispute.
And Ken Martin, who's the Democratic Party chair, released a statement about Thompson last week. And he said, quote, "Nobody credibly accused of such heinous acts has any place in elected office," unquote. And when you talk about people that were credibly accused of domestic violence, the first thing that came to mind for me was Keith Ellison, because it was right before his election in 2016, I believe, where the video came out. His son released a video of Ellison beating his wife and dragging her off the bed. And we saw these images where she had, big swollen face and black eye. And, that came out, and it was right before the election. I was seen as obviously a release very political, but nonetheless, he was reelected. And
right.
Or he was elected, not reelected. He was running.
Yeah.
He was congressman then. He was running for attorney general, and it was a big deal that he managed to be reelected, or that he managed to win the election. And so and he's the chief law enforcement officer in the state.
Correct.
And so we're talking in the absolutely credible. There was evidence, and so if John Thompson has to go for these reasons, then so too does Keith Ellison, and we need to take down the statues of George Floyd, right?
Right. Yeah. Another comparison we can make is Al Franken, who ended up being badgered into resigning from his office at the U.S. Senate because he was credibly accused of much less than what John Thompson has been accused of. And so it's been bothering me as I've been watching this story over the course of the past week since we talked about it in our last episode. The turn that happened at some point, there was this pivot, because Democrats were pretending that none of this was happening, after the traffic stop and the residency questions and the accusations of domestic abuse, that whole concept started to enter the ether of the public discourse, and Governor Tim Walz and Ken Martin and the DFL were just kind of ignoring it and pretending that it would go away, hoping that it would go away. And then there was this pivot that was made where all of a sudden on cue, they all turned on him and said, "You need to resign. You need to get out of here. This is unacceptable. Nobody who's been accused of these sorts of things should be serving in public office."
Yeah. Tim Walz came out and said, Minnesotans, this is a quote from Tim Walz, "Minnesotans deserve representatives who uphold the highest moral character and share our values. Following the deeply disturbing reports of domestic violence against multiple women, Representative Thompson can no longer effectively be that leader and should immediately resign. So he said multiple women just to, differentiate for his pal, Keith Ellison, who was just one.
And so I have to ask myself, because we know, and Keith Ellison is the prime example, we know that they are willing to ignore violence to women in order to forward their political agenda. We know that they don't actually care about the things that they claim to care about. That's very obvious in how they conduct themselves as a party and as individuals. And so what I've been asking myself is why would they turn on John Thompson, somebody who is kind of the poster child for everything that they are trying to present to the Black community as a reason why you ought to continue to vote Democrat and vote for DFL? Why would you turn on John Thompson, especially in a context where it so obviously beclowns you in relation to Keith Ellison? It's like, what, do you think we all forgot that those accusations were made against Ellison? That's not going to come up. We're not going to talk about it. You're really exposing your hypocrisy by doing that. And the only answer I can come up with, and I really think that there is no alternative, at least none that I can think of or that has been presented to me, as to why this disparity exists. It is a commentary on one aspect of John Thompson and Keith Ellison, which is their political utility. See, if you're running for statewide office, you're running to be attorney general, and you have the demonstrated capacity to leverage that position to forward the leftist agenda, which animates the DFL, then you quite literally can beat your girlfriend. It's all good. It's cool. Do whatever you want, But if you're just a lowly state representative representing one district, going back to the conversation we had about the election of the next Senate majority leader for the Republicans, the way these people think, and by these people, I mean elected representatives, regardless of party, they're constantly thinking about their majorities and the next election and how this, that, or the other thing is going to affect the prospects of the party going forward to either obtain or maintain majorities. And so at some point in this story, the cumulative facts surrounding John Thompson tipped a scale beyond which the political calculation was, we're going to be worse off with him than we will be without him. And it was only then that Governor Walz, the chief executive of this state, and his party decided that John Thompson has to go. It wasn't when they found out that he was credibly accused. It wasn't when they discovered that there might be residency issues. It wasn't when his character was revealed as deplorable. It was only after they calculated that it was a political liability to them personally and to their party that they made the decision that John Thompson has to go. They are no better than him. They are vile, hypocritical bastards, my words, not Jeremy's. And this episode demonstrates that.
I think you've great insight here, and I think you're spot on as far as I think John Thompson has ran his course in his usefulness as a representative for the cause. They brought him in because, well, first of all, I guess for me, what it really boils down to is they can control Keith Ellison. John Thompson, I mean, I don't know him well, but I've gotten to know him a little bit. He's genuinely a nice person when you're talking one-on-one. I'm sure this will be on North Star Liberty Alliance's website here. But I mean, genuinely, you
Munson comes out in defense of John Thompson.
He's honestly a nice person when you get to know when you talk with him. He's not like talking with Omar, Ilhan Omar or somebody. But when you give the guy a mic, I mean, everybody's in silence because they're watching this because they know that whatever they've told him, don't speak about this. they cannot control him. And he will say what he wants to say, and he's passionate and he's driven, and nobody's going to get in his way to get to what he wants to solve for issues for, whatever he's in St. Paul for. And they can't control him. That's why John Thompson, whose number one issue is police reform and judicial reform. And is he on the Public Safety and Judiciary Committee? No. He's on agriculture, like an underwater basket weaving, and like mental health, committee. He is not on any committee where he can be loud. They did not give the guy a megaphone. He hasn't been on the House floor until the special session. The entire legislative session went by and he didn't go to the floor once. They just kept him on committee or kept him on, Zoom remotely. So, they can't control him. They put him in a closet as much as they can, but they let him push for police reform, and it failed. It blew up, and it almost blew up the entire budget. You could tell that Hortman had a hard time controlling the posse caucus, this crazy caucus of 10 or 12 people that really just drag everybody. They make up the difference between having a majority or not. So nothing passes unless the posse caucus says it does. And John Thompson is a very vocal member of the posse caucus. So it's run its course, and they can't get this crazy defund the police stuff through because it's hurting Democrat causes in general. And so they want to just cut him loose. And whereas Keith Ellison, they can control. Keith Ellison is a good soldier and falls in line. And I think this is important for the Democrats to get rid of John Thompson so that Tim Walz can set foot in rural Minnesota. And as soon as somebody talks about this crazy burn the Hugo down guy, Walz can say, no, we got rid of him. Don't worry about it. He's not a problem anymore.
Right. Well, to which the follow-up question is, why did it take you so long? Why did you only get rid of him after the domestic abuse allegations piled up? Why didn't you get rid of him when he threatened to burn down a Minnesota city because a police union president lived there? Well, you and I, wasn't that egregious?
We talked about this last week, but they investigated that, and honestly, the charges didn't come because he wasn't charged with anything because it is political speech. And if you look at his words specifically, it was kind of a question of, you don't think people are going to come burn down Hugo? It wasn't like, we're going to burn down the city. It wasn't a direct threat. And it's political speech is protected speech. We can sit and debate that. But I want to point this out, and we can show this on the screen for people watching the video. There's an incident report that I put on social media with some stuff highlighted about how he's threatening to choke his wife and threatening to kill people, and that she had bruises on her fingertips and her neck. The printing date, I thought it was the date of the incident, but it's the date that the incident report was printed was October 18th of 2020. So it was before the election. It was after, I believe this was after Hugo. And I believe this might have come through Alpha News, because Alpha News did a story on this. And I believe Thompson's comments were, that's not me, that's a different John Thompson, which maybe is believable by voters. But now we find out it really was him. But this was out in the news, at least Alpha Media or conservative news, before the election. The mainstream media chose not to investigate.
Yeah, well, and obviously that's an ongoing problem with our media here in this state. But nonetheless, I mean, the facts are what the facts are, and the lack of the hypocritical contrast in treatment between Thompson and Ellison, and then you could throw in Franken in there just for another comparison, is really revealing of the character of the people that we're dealing with and who are in control of this state.
I think that the Me Too movement took down a lot of people that were deserving of it. And also people got caught in the wake. I never supported Franken getting booted from the legislature, from the Senate. I used to follow him as a comedian. I used to read his books. I think his political commentary was pretty pretty funny. And even if I didn't agree with his policies, but there's a line I draw too on stuff that occurs before you're a public servant and stuff that occurs while you have the trust of the people. And I know that you can't just say everything you did before you're elected, you ignore. But what Franken was a comedian traveling with other comedians and, doing stuff that was inappropriate of a senator, but perhaps different contexts of being a comedian.
Yeah. Well, but see, that contrast just bolsters the point. What Franken was accused of and what brought down his political career as a U.S. senator in the state of Minnesota was nothing compared to what Keith Ellison was credibly accused of, or what John Thompson has been credibly accused of. And yet look at the results. Look at what was recorded to moment. And so the bottom line on all of this is there's either a principle here that the left is attempting to enforce through their political machinations of the Democratic Party, the DFL in Minnesota, or it's all just political theater and a bunch of BS. And I think you know where I stand on that question.
Yeah. Keith Ellison's is it ex-wife or ex-girlfriend, the one that he had beat, she went out. She's been taken to social media now too, and actually criticizing Governor Walz when Governor Walz put out that tweet that I read earlier about Representative Thompson can no longer effectively be the leader and should immediately resign. Karen Monahan retweeted the governor's tweet and said, "This is political theater. You supported Keith after I broke my silence. Whatever works in your best interests, you will go either way." So she's very vocal about this and effectively calling out hypocrisy. One more thing I want to touch on the John Thompson thing is there was of course, between the Speaker Hortman and Kurt Dowd, who's the minority leader in the House, they've been sending letters back and forth because Eric Lucero 2 weeks ago, just last week, filed an ethics complaint, which is a serious issue, against John Thompson because John Thompson called Eric Lucero a racist on the House floor. John Thompson was basically unmuted himself during Eric Lucero's speech and tried to interrupt and say, "Hey, what are we voting now, or what's going on? Do I have to sit and listen to this?" And then he said Eric Lucero told the speaker to direct him that he's out of order, and he kind of just said under his breath that you're racist. And so Eric Lucero, who's believe he's Hispanic, he's your representative, right? Yep. He took offense to it, and he filed an ethics complaint because he was mad that he was called a racist. And I didn't sign in his letter. He asked me to sign on in support. And I just, with all the stuff going on and how important stuff, we're trying to end the emergency powers and things. I didn't feel like people should be arguing about hurt feelings, especially from our side of the aisle. So I didn't really support the ethics complaint. But he has this Friday on the 23rd of July, John Thompson has an ethics board hearing in the Minnesota House. They could basically choose to recommend that he be ousted, and it could come to the floor for a vote because of that. I doubt it will go that far, but the speaker has basically sent a letter to Kurt Dowd that because Kurt Dowd has asked her, "You need to get rid of Thompson," and she said, "We're not going to file anything until the end of these court cases, but you're welcome to file one, and we'll immediately hear it." Well, basically, she's asking for Kurt Dowd or a Republican in the House to file an ethics complaint so that she can take it up and bring it for a vote and basically let Republicans boot him, have Republicans make him the martyr for people in the BLM movement. And I hope that Republicans don't take the bait. I think we just allow them to get rid of him if that's what they want to do. Personally, I like due process. And if he's found guilty of domestic violence or other things, we can have a hearing in the House. But I don't want to be part of just ejecting someone because it's politically convenient for Walz. I'd love to use John Thompson to hang Walz I shouldn't say it like that because it sounds like a threat. I hope that John Thompson sinks Walz's boat as he goes out campaigning in rural Minnesota.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope that that strategic pitfall that you outlined is obvious enough that Republicans won't fall into it. But then, we are talking about Republicans after all. There's a sense in which John Thompson sticking around is great for conservatives and Republicans. I mean, if the Democrats don't want to oust him, great, fine. He's the new poster child. Here's your DFL.
Yes.
This is what you're voting for.
He's like Ilhan Omar. Ilhan Omar was fantastic for Republican fundraising. She was on the literature in fact, even in the last election, she was on the literature of a lot of mailers going out into Republican districts because she was the poster child of the DFL. John Thompson, who's not as well known because he hasn't been in the media as much until just this last week, he will be on the literature of mailers to rally support in the conservative base if he's still in the legislature next year.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to be strategically illiterate to fall for that and to set the Democrats up to pretend to be the victims, which is their number one, strategy and play that they call on a regular basis. By all means, let them take full responsibility. They've got the majority, right? It's their house. It's their, they're the ones who are in control of it. So it's up to them to lead it, so let them lead it.
No, you're right. And if they force a vote on the House floor and somebody like Shelley Christensen, who's in Stillwater, is forced to vote on whether to boot Representative Thompson or not, she has to vote to get rid of him because otherwise the campaign mailers to her district is Shelley Christensen supports this man who threatened teenage girls outside a house in Hugo, threatening to burn it down or all that kind of stuff. It's going to be ugly.
They brought on themselves, not just in the sense that Democrats in his district endorsed and nominated and voted for him, but they brought on themselves in that they have adopted these narratives that he has championed. And they've bought into the broader critical race theory paradigm, which makes excuses for people like John Thompson, which says a actual application of CRT is that you get to behave like John Thompson because you're black. If another person, if a white legislator went to, I don't know, North Minneapolis and said, we're going to burn this place down, or people are going to come and burn this place down, however he said it, we know what would happen. We know what the political consequences of something like that would be. CRT says your behavior, the moral quality of your behavior is determined by the color of your skin. Now, that is, of course, atrocious and racist and irrational and stupid and evil. But that's the Democratic Party. That's where they're at. And so I don't feel sorry for them at all. This is their mess. Republicans should let them clean it up. And then, I'm not a big fan of reactionary politics, but in this case, you got to let them make their move and then react accordingly.
Yeah. And on that note of CRT, I wanted to talk about it. And it's not just the policy of the Democrats. CRT is being tolerated by those who are not politically active, those who are not politically woke. And they're being lied to in communities around Minnesota. In Mankato, just this week, the school board had a hearing on critical race theory policies and what to move forward with. And I got a lot of emails from conservatives, or I shouldn't say a lot. I got a few from conservative activists in the area who basically said Mankato School Board is having a meeting on Tuesday, and this is on the agenda. They want to pass this. Let people know, but don't put it on social media. I got the same message from several people. Don't put it on social media. They didn't want to turn it into a zoo, yet hardly anybody showed up, and nobody spoke out against it. Because, they're just non-confrontational Minnesotans and it passed. We didn't get organized on our side. We didn't get together and say, okay, you're going to speak first. You're going to speak next. Oh, Walter, you're black. You'd be great to go out and actually make these points, do this, this, and this. But don't give the bottom line is don't give the media, the liberal media, that conservative that's out there and slips and says the wrong thing or makes accusations or says the thing that is going to be the headline on why these crazy conservatives show up, and you're gonna give the Democrats fuel. So you've been to some of these meetings and you've actually given presentations on it. What are three? Because it's coming to Lake Crystal, this little town that I live near, which is like 1,800 or 2,000 people. They're going to be voting on it in the next week or so. What can conservatives bring up as points to tear down the critical race theory agenda? And it's not called critical race theory; it's called other stuff, right? They're going to say, well, it's not that, but what can they use as points to tear down and to call it what it is, and tear down this agenda and actually convince the school board to delay it or to vote no?
I'll just start talking and we'll see if it coalesces into 3 points. The primary thing I would say, if I only had a limited amount of time to say it, is that we need to focus on what the education mission is. Why do we have school districts? Why do we send our kids to school? What is it that we're trying to achieve with K through 12 education? And the answer to that, I believe, is that we are trying to take children who by their very nature lack the capacity to successfully negotiate reality. And we're trying to solve that over the course of 13 years. We're trying to get them to a point where when they graduate high school and achieve the milestone of 18 years lived on this earth, they can go forward, they can go out into the world, and they can successfully negotiate reality and pursue values which will enrich their lives. That's the purpose of education. It's the only reason to send them to school. If that's not what you're trying to do by sending your kids to school, then I would love to know what you're trying to do. Okay? If that's the mission, you cannot allow critical race theory in your school district. Why? Because the stated clear objective of critical theory of all sorts, whether it's race theory, gender theory, queer theory, whatever, the stated objective is to subvert objectivity and reason. A critical component of CRT is what author and pastor Vodi Bakum calls ethnic Gnosticism. Stick with me here. These are some high-level terms. But in philosophy, there's this branch called epistemology, which is how we know what we know. What is the nature of knowledge, and how can it be said that we actually know something? Classical liberal education of the type that you and I went through when we were growing up, and of the type that we assume that we're sending our kids off to when we put them on the bus, has an answer for that, and that is reason. You perceive the world through your senses, and then you apply your mind to the task of interpreting what you're perceiving rationally in order to discover what is true, what is factual, what is real. And then you adjust to that. You conform your ideas, emotions, expectations, and pursuits to the reality in which you live. CRT says, no. That's part of the white supremacy hegemony. That is a power dynamic. That's one way of looking at things. In point of fact, the actual truth is determined not by perceptions of reality and the application of reason, but by lived experience. The lived experience of the oppressed individual or the oppressed community determines the woke reality, the reality that you should wake to and conform yourself to. And so it's not what you see or hear or have experienced as a white person that determines what is real, determines what is true, because you're an oppressor. It's what the victim has experienced. It's their lived experience that determines reality. Ethnic Gnosticism is the idea that because I have darker skin than you, I have access to knowledge which you cannot have. My lived experience. And my lived experience trumps any argument, consideration, or concern that you might articulate. You, as a white person, you are to decenter yourself. You are to check your privilege. You are to defer to the moral authority that is granted me by virtue of my melanin. This is what CRT is. It is an anti-reason, anti-reality, fantastical attempt to deconstruct reality itself. It is the opposite of education. It is uneducation. It is indoctrination. It is inquisition. It says you are guilty of sin by virtue of the color of your skin, and you cannot escape that guilt. There is no salvation. There is no conversion. There is no moment upon which you're justified or sanctified. You're white, therefore you're guilty always and forever. And therefore you must take your place in the totem of the new racial hegemony that they are going to build. This is vile. This is on par with the worst political, philosophical, and ideological manifestations we've seen over the course of the centuries. The most direct comparisons would be the Maoist movement of the 20th century, the communist movement of the 20th century, and indeed, although, Godwin's law and all this, the Nazis and fascism. In fact, that's probably the best comparison, because at the root of what the Nazis were doing philosophically was the idea that your ethnic identity, your racial identity, was the definitive characteristic about you, that it determined your worth, your moral authority, and your ranking in society. And that's exactly the same thing that CRT is pushing.
And that's a great explanation of critical race theory, and a great argument for you to make, Walter. But for the average conservative to go in and start talking at this level about critical race theory, first of all, they're probably going to cut them off because they're not going to get 8 minutes to talk about it. But they're going to stop. Wait a minute. Yeah, you can't talk about Nazis or Mao, but they're probably going to cut someone off right away and say, this isn't critical race theory. All we're doing, and I was trying to get smart with my Googling and try to find some websites that could bring up arguments about, like, against conservatives. And I found this great one on CNN, what is critical race, what it is and what it isn't. But it actually is, it doesn't work that well for an argument against it, because it talks about how critical race theory recognizes that systemic racism is part of American society. And basically they're going to come back to you and to any conservative and say, look, all we want to do is recognize that racism has existed and still does exist, and talk about it. And what you're trying to say is that we shouldn't talk about our divisive past and about how racism has existed in America.
Yeah, that's a rhetorical strategy called a Mott and Bailey. And if you'll go with me on this little journey for just a minute or so, what that is a reference to is there was a certain type of castle in the Middle Ages where you would have what was called a bailey, which is kind of like the land surrounded by light defenses like a moat or a wall. And that was your land that you wanted to protect and your territory that you wanted to control. But in the case that you were attacked and your opponents were able to overwhelm those light defenses, you could retreat into the motte, which was the fortified castle where you could hold up in there under siege forever if necessary and just throw down hot oil and rain down arrows or whatever and outlast the siege of your opponents. In rhetorical terms, a Mott and Bailey functions in the same way. So for CRT, the Bailey is everything I just articulated: ethnic Gnosticism, your moral authority is determined by skin color, lived experience trumps objective reality. If you're white, you are guilty of racism by virtue of the color of your skin. That's the Bailey. When you call them out on that, regardless of whether you're me or you're the average conservative, you're absolutely right. They will retreat into the Mott. And the Mott is, all we're trying to do is talk about history. All we're trying to do is point out that racism has existed in the United States, and we're trying to have a conversation about it. Why are you against that? You have to call that out. You have to say no. And look, I advocate for saying it in exactly this way. No, you are lying. We have historically always acknowledged the racism and the historical fact of chattel slavery, the historical fact of Jim Crow, segregation. Yeah, and look, I'm a multiracial guy, product of and partner in interracial marriage, born in 1978. I grew up hearing about this stuff my whole life. Nobody's been hiding it. Nobody's been sweeping this crap under the rug. It's been part of the public discourse and part of education for as long as I've been alive. What they are trying to do is something novel and something different. It is not just talking about racism. It is not just talking about history. It is engaging in, and again, for somebody who's going to go and confront a school board on this, you need to read up on it. You need to go read Vodi Bakkum's book, Fault Lines. You need to go read Richard Delgado et al.'s book, Critical Race Theory and Introduction. They are proponents of critical race theory. So it's coming from the horse's mouth with them. You need to learn what this stuff is and how it works. The objective here is not merely to talk about the fact that racism is something that's existed in the past. It's to redefine what we even mean when we use the word racism. It's to redefine what we even mean when we use the phrase white supremacy. It's to redefine what we even mean when we talk about systems. Every word that they use, every phrase that they employ, they are referencing their thesaurus, their dictionary. They have come up with all new definitions for these terms, and they are using the terminology purposefully as a mot, as a place to retreat to, hoping that you won't recognize their actual meaning and that you'll be like, oh, okay, well, I guess if you're just going to teach history, or I guess if you're just going to condemn racism, well, I guess that's fine. What they're not telling you is that by racism, they mean the fact that you exist as a white person.
But when they retreat to their mot and say, oh, it's only about this, then why can't you surround them on that argument and say, well, then let's change what you have here, outlined here, and let's make an amendment to it and say that we're only going to teach accurate history about slavery. You want to have a conversation about slavery? Fine. But that's what we're going to talk about. But we're not going to be, or maybe if you want to talk about slavery, let's get into the green energy stuff and start talking about slavery in Africa and how it exists today. But let's not divide. Let's not have a program where we're going to bring in people, separate everybody in the room so that the black children go here, the white children go there, and then tell the black children that your white friends are racist. They don't know it. And then go tell the white people you are racist and you don't know it. And challenge everything that they were brought up with about equality and treating everybody fairly, and pushing guilt on everybody.
Yeah, that you're absolutely right. That is the counter strategy to the Mott and Bailey. You have to, as James Lindsay puts it, you have to take their Mott and then from the position of their Mott, assault their Bailey, right? So you said it exactly. You're like, oh, you want to teach history? All right, fine. Let's talk about the history of slavery throughout human civilization. For as long as there have been human beings, let's talk about Aztec slavery. Let's talk about Native American slavery. Let's talk about the conquest of territory from tribes in Asia or India or wherever. Like, you want to talk about history? Let's talk about history. And what you'll very quickly reveal by pushing that is saying, oh, no, we can't talk about any of those things. We can only talk about how white people are bad. We can only talk about how Western civilization and the United States and Europeans specifically are uniquely evil. Those are the only things we can talk about. And at that point, you've revealed to anybody who's neutral and observing this process that these are not sincere people, that they in fact have a Bailey that they actually value and are trying to protect from this false Mott that they've constructed.
I feel like we are outgunned and outorganized, and that this critical race theory they've all been organizing for a decade, and it's been unleashed, and we're unprepared on our side. We don't have, especially when you're up against academia, It's so hard to go in and challenge academia when you don't have the alphabet soup after your name with all the titles in your education saying that you're coming from a position of authority on this. The most successful arguments against critical race theory that are shared widely on social media come from people of color that are in there arguing against it, because that it just visibly looks like the best argument against it, even though that is not what's necessary. But it is. In Minnesota culture, non-confrontational culture, it shuts down the arguments, right? It's harder for a bunch of white school board members to preach to someone of color who's sitting there talking about how they don't want their kids being taught critical race theory.
Here's my prescription. Get over it. Whitey, get over it. Defend your culture, defend your family, defend your life, because all of them are under assault and your enemy wants to destroy them in turn. Your niceness and your hesitance and your fear of being called a racist. First of all, you need to just, it's kind of like, it's been a while since I've watched it, but Band of Brothers, there's this episode where one of the characters is just having a hell of a time with the fact that they're constantly under attack and being bombarded, and he's so scared and he's kind of cowering and he doesn't know how to handle it. And there's a more veteran character who's just like cool as a cucumber under fire and isn't reacting to the bombs going off and the buildings rattling and what have you. And at one point there's this scene where the vet tells the younger guy, he's like, look, what you need to do is you need to just resign yourself to the fact that you are going to die.
The only hope you have is to accept the fact that you're already dead.
You need to make the decision right now that you have no intention of ever going home. That's how you get through this, is by not having the expectation that you are going to survive. And in a similar sense, my prescription for my white brothers and sisters on the, I don't even want to say conservative, on the normal American Western civilization side of this argument is you have to resign yourselves to the inevitability that you are going to be called a racist and a bigot. You're going to be called names. Okay. You're not going to die. You're not going to get bombed like this character in Band of Brothers. You're going to be called names. And so man up, let what you got drop and get after it. And take it in turn. Because here's the thing, what they're counting on when they call you a racist or they're calling you a bigot, what they're counting on is for you to react to that accusation in the way you would if the person making it had a credible case, right? So they're counting on you reacting as if there's actually something to it. But there's not. It's empty. They've redefined the term. And so you just push past it and you say, no, I'm not leaving. I'm not going to stop talking. I'm going to make my point. I'm a taxpayer. I'm a resident. I'm a citizen. And you're sitting here telling me that my kids ought to be taught that they're inferior on the count of the color of their skin. And I'm not going to stand for it. And you just push past it. I don't care what names you call me. I don't care. You label me a bigot. You label me a racist, because here's the thing, Jeremy, it can't just be me. It can't just be me and the handful of darker conservatives making the rounds to every school district in the state. It's not going to work. White people, and I'm saying this explicitly and intentionally, white people need to stand up and defend themselves aggressively. And by aggressively, I mean take no prisoners. People need to know that there are going to be long-term and definitive political and financial consequences to pushing this garbage. I'll give you an example. We've talked about it here before. In my school district, there's an operating referendum that's going to be on the ballot this November. They're coming to us asking for more money out of my pocket directly, out of my wallet. They're not getting my vote. And in turn, I'm going to make sure that I campaign on them not getting money until such time as I'm convinced that they're going to root this CRT nonsense out. You have to make them feel the pain, and you can't be bluffing. You can't be bluffing. You have to be willing to say, I will watch my school district collapse financially before I will allow it to thrive towards the purpose of teaching racism to my children. That's a pretty easy stance to take when you think about it in those terms.
Well, in addition to critical race theory being ushered into through the metro, the larger cities, it's going to be coming to small towns like mine, where I just can't believe. I mean, I'm just in shock that it's coming up on the agenda. But it's also going to be not paired, but it's going to be coming at the same time as the potential for mask mandates in the fall. So if you think conservatives aren't already upset about CRT, the talk of a mask mandate, this week, the American Academy of Pediatrics released a study saying that they recommend masks this fall for every child over the age of 2, and including kids that are fully vaccinated. So even if they lower the age that you can vaccinate kids to 6 or 5 years old so they can vaccinate every kid in school, they're still recommending masks. The CDC came out this week and said they recommend all kids wear masks, even if they're vaccinated. And parents are fuming because they do not want this. They are going to be coming to their school boards. If critical race theory doesn't get into the school boards, the mask mandate or the threat of the mask mandate is going to get them out there. And people are going to make the decisions to pull their kids out of public school. They're going to put the kids in private school that are already at 130% of their capacity. And that's where the schools are going to suffer. Minnesota passed a law, or we have a law in the books already, that if you take a kid out of the school district, that school district still gets 25%, I think, of the funding of the kid taken out.
I was wondering if and when they were going to do something like that, because indeed what you're describing has already started to happen. People have pulled their kids out of schools.
Yeah, I believe, and I'm not on the education finance committee. I could talk to Draz on this one, but I believe that they passed one saying that for all the kids that were taken out of schools last year, the schools got like 100% of the funding for those kids because they were counting on it, But I believe going forward, the old rule still is a fact where the kid, they get 25% of that funding for at least a year to help them with, cover the cost of stuff. But enrollment is significantly down, and it will be between the mask mandate and critical race theory. So if you can't talk to them, if you can't talk circles around them like you can with critical race theory, the threat of pulling kids out of school is going to be big. And especially in my community where we have a lot of small town school districts, I live right between 2 towns. I could send my kids to Lake Crystal or Medelia. And if Lake Crystal enacts critical race theory and Medelia chooses not to, people in my situation may choose to enroll their kids in a different school district.
So I think you're hitting on a key strategic point. With the whole Mott and Bailey rhetorical strategy, what they're trying to do is they're trying to outlast your scrutiny. So they're trying to provide a plausible explanation for what's going on that will satiate you, if not convince you, at least satiate you long enough that they can move forward with their agenda, right? That you go away and you move forward with their agenda. And it's the whole concept, though, the vulnerability of this rhetorical technique and many rhetorical techniques is that it's based on the premise that your job as the parent, taxpayer, resident coming before them as the school board, that your job is to convince them that you are right. That's the premise you need to reject. It's not your job to convince them that you're right about what they're doing. It's their job to convince you that they're not going to do what you don't want. And so what you say at the end of the day is, listen, this isn't a debate. I didn't come here to convince you that what I know to be true is right. I came here to tell you what my expectations are. You will get rid of this nonsense. You will get rid of courageous conversations and Glenn Singleton and critical race theory and anything associated with it. It will be expunged from the curriculum, and teachers who teach it and who pull students aside lecturing them about their white privilege will be removed. That will happen, or You will never get another dime from this community in the form of a referendum. And I'm pulling my kids out of the school. And again, these cannot be bluffs. You have to mean it. And you have to be committed to it politically. And you have to organize around these goals. That this is what we're going to do. We are going to starve you anymore unless you come our way. So you need to convince me. I don't need to convince you. You need to convince me, or there will be consequences.
I like that approach, Walter. And I think that one is, but it takes activists. It takes people organizing. It's just, starting with a petition, getting tons of signatures in town saying this shouldn't be taught in the schools. And, we need to organize that way. I think that's effective, especially hitting them where the finance. Now, school board members may come back and say, "Hey, it's not really a local decision. It's the mandate from St. Paul, from Teachers Union."
Yeah. So again, you're telling me that it's a state mandate to teach my children to be racists. That's your position? And again, I don't have to convince you that that's what you're doing. I'm convinced that that's what you're doing. And so as your boss, as the person who pays your bills and writes your check that you cash biweekly, I'm telling you we're not doing that. Be damned whatever the state says. I will have that fight. And I expect you to have that fight. I expect you to flip the bird to Governor Walz and to the state authorities, the Department of Education. They don't get to decide that my kid is going to be taught that he's worth less because of the color of his skin. That's not a decision they get to make.
Well, I hope the listeners have some good takeaways from this conversation on critical race theory, because if it isn't already pushed in your schools, it is coming. And it will, you will get about a week's notice, if that it's on the agenda. So go to your school board, look up the agenda, call your one or two conservative members of that board so that they can maybe help you get a heads up, organize, and don't give the liberal media, who will be there recording the conversation, don't give them the soundbite that they need to paint you as a radical. You need to make relevant points and have your one sentence for the media when they do ask you for a comment about, plan this right. And you can take back your schools.
That's the one place where we might differ on this, is because my fear is that if you go into it with that concern, that you're going to pull your punches and you're going to be ineffective. Again, no matter what, they'll find a soundbite. They'll patch together, 5 words from different sentences and make it into something that makes you sound like a Nazi, right? Like they're going to do that. And so again, you just have to resolve yourself to it. I'm going to be called a racist. I'm going to be called a bigot. I'm going to be called this, that, and the other thing. And they're going to take things I say out of context and they're going to misrepresent it and they're going to lie because they're liars. That's who they are. That's what all of this is. Okay. So when you're fighting against liars, there isn't some strategy you're going to employ that keeps them from lying. The only thing that's going to work here is not, convincing the media to portray you in a wonderful light. It's going to be overwhelming political force. It's going to be creating an environment in which they can't move forward with their agenda. That does not require the media being on your side, because guess what the media doesn't get to do in your town? Vote. If there are enough people in that room and around town who think like you and who are coming your way, it doesn't matter how the media portrays it. And that conviction of this isn't about how we're perceived. This is about what our children are taught and the values that they're enabled to pursue and their self-esteem. Think about the psychological, mental, and spiritual abuse of teaching a child that the color of their skin is determinative one way or the other. That is evil. It is unimaginable, unfathomable evil, and it is in your school district. You're going to pull your punches because you're afraid of what somebody's going to call you? No. You're going to burn it down you are going to go in there rhetorically. You're going to go in there and you're going to make it impossible for your opponents to succeed one way or the other, either because they do what you came there demanding they do, or because you rob them of the fuel which keeps them going, which is your kids and your money.
Well, fantastic, Walter. You've wrapped it up, and we need to take this battle on. I'm convinced we need to organize, and so get organized in your towns and get people involved and get people to the meetings. So this wraps up a great episode of the Omnibus Podcast. Walter, thank you again for co-hosting, and we will be we'll be back next week with an episode of finding out if we're going to have a Republican leading the Senate. My God, I can't believe we're talking about that. All right, thank you so much for listening.